Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to this channel if you love stories that bring the Bible to life in ways that are deep, meaningful, and just a little bit humorous. Tap that bell so you never miss another journey into the sacred and the surprising. Now, let us dive into the story of Hagar, the woman who ran, the woman who wept, the woman who was seen by God. Long, long ago, in the vast, sun-bleached lands of the ancient Near East, before kings rose and fell, and before nations were carved into history books, there lived a woman whose name would echo across centuries, not because she wore a crown, and not because she was a warrior, but because she was a maid. Her name was Hagar. She was an Egyptian, born of the Nile civilization, and yet found herself living not among pharaohs and pyramids, but within the tent of a wandering old couple, Abram and Sarai. Now, if that name sounds familiar, it should. This was the same Abram whom God had called out of Ur, promising to make him the father of many nations. The same Sarai who was so beautiful that even foreign kings were smitten by her, despite the fact that she was well past the age of chasing butterflies, let alone bearing children. Let us be honest here. Sarai was a woman of faith, yes, but she was also a woman with eyes that worked just fine. And her womb? Well, that was a different story. She had tried. Oh, how she had tried. But month after month, year after year, her hopes withered like grapes in the desert sun. And God who had made such grand promises to her husband, had still not opened her womb. And so Sarai, in a move that might raise modern eyebrows and spark theological debate in Bible study groups around the world, devised a plan. If she could not bear children, perhaps she could build a family through her maidservant. And who better than Hagar, the young Egyptian, loyal and quiet, who had probably not even asked to be part of this divine soap opera. So Sarai turned to Abram, her wrinkled but still virile husband, and said, "Behold now, the Lord hath restrained me from bearing. Go in, I pray thee, unto my maid. It may be that I may obtain children by her." And Abram, who at that moment may have blinked in surprise or stammered like a man caught in a holy loophole, obeyed. Now, one would think that such a moment would be preceded by prayer, reflection, or at least a conversation about boundaries. But no, Hagar was given to Abram as a wife, not a concubine, mind you, but a wife, though clearly not of equal standing. And soon after she conceived, just like that. The silence that had hovered over the tent for so many years was broken by the promise of new life. But what began as a solution quickly unraveled into a mess worthy of a daytime drama. Hagar, no longer just the maid, but the one carrying the child, looked upon Sarai with a new gaze, and Sarai saw it. Perhaps Hagar walked with a different posture, or perhaps her silence grew more pronounced, carrying with it a message Sarai did not like. Whatever it was, Sarai went from hopeful to furious. She stormed to Abram, likely flailing her arms in that specific tone only a long-married wife can master, saying, "My wrong be upon thee. I have given my maid into thy bosom, and when she saw that she had conceived, I was despised in her eyes." In simpler words, "This is your fault, old man." And Abram, wise or perhaps just weary of navigating female fury, answered with a shrug, "Only ancient husbands can perfect. Behold, thy maid is in thy hand, do to her as it pleaseth thee." Translation, "She is your servant. You handle it." So Sarai afflicted Hagar. What that affliction looked like, we do not fully know. Harsh words, more chores, emotional coldness, all of the above perhaps. But it was enough that Hagar, pregnant and alone, ran away into the wilderness. She fled. She did not ask permission. She did not say goodbye. She ran toward the unknown, away from pain, away from humiliation, away from a life that had become unbearable. And that is when something extraordinary happened. There, in the barren wilderness near a spring of water on the road to Shur, the angel of the Lord found her. Not a servant, not a man, not a priest, the angel of the Lord himself. And he called her by name. Hagar, Sarai's maid, he said. Imagine the sound of your name spoken by divinity itself in the middle of your lowest point. It was not a rebuke. It was recognition. Whence camest thou? And whither wilt thou go? He asked, not because he did not know the answers, but because he wanted her to think, to remember, to reckon with her pain. And Hagar, perhaps trembling, perhaps half delirious from fear and fatigue, answered simply, I flee from the face of my mistress Sarai. Then came the words that no one expected. The angel said, Return to thy mistress, and submit thyself under her hands. Oh, now that was not the kind of advice Hagar wanted. Go back to the woman who mistreated her? Go back to the pain? But the message was not without promise. The angel continued, I will multiply thy seed exceedingly, that it shall not be numbered for multitude. A promise for her, not just for Abram, not through Sarai, but through her, Hagar, the Egyptian, the outsider, the maid. And he said more, Behold, thou art with child, and shalt bear a son, and shalt call his name Ishmael, because the Lord hath heard thy affliction. Ishmael, meaning God hears. He went on to describe the boy. He will be a wild man. His hand will be against every man, and every man's hand against him. And he shall dwell in the presence of all his brethren. In other words, this child was not going to be quiet nor easy. He would be fierce and free and impossible to ignore. And then came one of the most beautiful moments in Scripture. Hagar gave God a name. She said, Thou, God, seest me. In Hebrew, El Roi. For she said, Have I also here looked after him that seeth me? In a world where gods were distant, silent, or carved in stone, Hagar discovered a God who sees, a God who finds runaway servants, a God who speaks promises into empty wildernesses. She called the well where this happened, Bir Lahai Roi, the well of the living one who sees me. And with that, Hagar returned. She went back to the tent, to Sarai, to the very place she had fled from. But now she returned not as just a servant, not as just a womb on loan, but as one who had been seen and named and promised by God himself. In due time, she bore a son, and Abram, true to the instruction, named him Ishmael. Abram was 86 years old when the boy was born, and as the child's cries filled the tent, one can only imagine the tension that remained. Sarai still had no child. Hagar had given birth to a son. And the God who sees? He was still writing the story, but of course that story was far from over. Years passed in the tent of Abram, and life for Hagar was never as simple as feeding her son and watching him grow. Ishmael's laughter and boyish energy filled the camp, but so did tension. Sarai, still childless, watched this boy run, play, and call Abram father, and every joyful shout was a reminder of what she did not have. Yet God was not done with Sarai. One astonishing day, after all the years of waiting, God himself visited Abram again and changed his name to Abraham, the father of many nations, and Sarai's name to Sarah, the mother of nations. And just when everyone had accepted that Sarah's womb was as good as a locked granary in a famine, God promised that she would bear her own son? Abraham laughed when he heard it, not the quiet, polite laugh you give when someone tells an improbable story, but the kind that shakes your whole body. Sarah laughed too, silently, behind the tent flap, because it was simply too much. She was far past the season of motherhood, and here was God speaking of cradles and midnight feedings. But sure enough, in the fullness of time, Sarah bore Isaac, the child of promise. Now the arrival of Isaac did not erase the past. In fact, it brought old wounds into sharper relief. Ishmael was no longer the only son. His position in the family shifted overnight. Abraham's attention, once solely focused on Ishmael as the heir, now moved toward Isaac. Hagar, who had once walked with the quiet confidence of a mother of the heir, found herself in the shadow of the new miracle child. And Ishmael, being a boy of strong spirit, began to show his own feelings on the matter. One day, Sarah saw Ishmael mocking, perhaps teasing his little half-brother, perhaps making sport of the feast that celebrated Isaac's weaning. Whatever it was, Sarah saw more than just boyish mischief. She saw a threat to her son's inheritance. She marched to Abraham with the certainty of a woman whose mind was made up. "Cast out this bondwoman and her son," she demanded, "for the son of this bondwoman shall not be heir with my son, even with Isaac." To Sarah, there could be no divided inheritance, no confusion about who would carry the promise forward. Abraham was deeply grieved. After all, Ishmael was his son, flesh of his flesh, blood of his blood. He loved the boy. But God spoke to Abraham, telling him not to be distressed because of the lad or because of Hagar. "In Isaac shall thy seed be called," God said. Yet he also promised that Ishmael would become a nation, for he was Abraham's seed. And so, with a heavy heart, Abraham rose early the next morning. He took bread and a skin of water and gave it to Hagar, placing it on her shoulder along with her child. Now, if you picture Ishmael as a tiny toddler here, remember the timeline. He was likely in his mid-teens. But Scripture emphasizes that Hagar still bore the burden of caring for him entirely. And so, once again, Hagar found herself walking away from the tent, away from all she had known, into the desert. This was no bold runaway escape as before. This was exile. They wandered in the wilderness of Beersheba, and under the relentless sun, their water ran out. If you have ever been in the desert without water, you know that the heat feels like it is peeling your very soul. Hagar, exhausted and seeing her son's life slipping away, placed Ishmael under the shade of a shrub, probably the only one she could find, and walked a bowshot away. She could not bear to watch him die, and she lifted her voice and wept. But the God who had found her years ago by the spring of water found her again. An angel of God called to her from heaven and said, "What aileth thee, Hagar? Fear not, for God hath heard the voice of the lad where he is. Arise, lift up the lad, and hold him in thine hand, for I will make him a great nation." Imagine the relief in those words, hope spoken into despair, promise spoken into what seemed like an ending. Then God opened her eyes, and she saw a well of water. It had been there all along, but sometimes grief clouds the eyes so much that miracles hide in plain sight. She went, filled the skin with water, and gave the boy a drink. Life flowed back into him, and they rose again. From that day, God was with the lad. Ishmael grew up in the wilderness, becoming exactly as the angel had said years before, a skilled archer, fierce and free. He dwelt in the wilderness of Paran, and Hagar, faithful to her duty as a mother, took him a wife from the land of Egypt. Perhaps, she thought, if my son cannot grow up in the tents of Abraham, at least he will have roots in the land of my birth. And so, the woman who once fled into the desert with nothing but sorrow ended her story not in defeat, but in the knowledge that her son had a future. She had been the only woman in Scripture to name God, calling him the God who sees me, and her life was proof of it. Twice she had been cast into the wilderness, and twice God had found her there, not because she was the wife of a patriarch, not because she held status or wealth, but because he hears the cries of the afflicted and sees the ones the world overlooks. The story of Hagar is more than a side note in the history of Abraham and Sarah. It is a testament to God's presence in the lives of those on the margins. It tells every person who has been pushed out, forgotten, or dismissed that there is a God who sees, who hears, and who provides. And that is why her story endures, not just in the pages of Scripture, but in the hope of every soul who finds themselves wandering, thirsty, and unsure if God remembers their name. So, when you think of Hagar, remember not only her tears in the desert, but the wells God placed in her path. Remember that sometimes the miracle is not the water appearing, but our eyes being opened to see that it was there all along. If this story touched you, make sure to like, share, and subscribe so you can discover more powerful and life-changing Bible stories. And remember, just like Hagar, you are seen, you are heard, and you are never forgotten.